Imagine a king so powerful that his every word could change the course of history, yet so desperate for something as simple as fragile as the birth of a son, that he would cast aside wives, defy the greatest religious authority in Europe, and even send women he once adored to the executioner's block. This is not a work of fiction. It is not a Shakespearean tragedy, though Shakespeare himself would later draw inspiration from it. This is history, raw, bloody, and chillingly real. It is the story of Henry VIII of England, a man remembered not only for his throne, his wars, and his grand palaces, but most infamously for his 6 wives, and the horrifying fates that awaited some of them. At the dawn of the 16th century, England was a nation standing at the edge of change. The medieval world of knights, castles, and feudal loyalties was fading, giving way to the Renaissance, an era of new ideas, art, exploration, and ambition. But within the royal court, the future of England did not hinge on art or philosophy. It hinged on something far more personal: whether the king's wife could give birth to a living, healthy son. Dynasties in Europe rose and fell on the shoulders of male heirs. Without one, civil wars could erupt, foreign powers could invade, and rival families could tear a kingdom apart. This fear was not abstract for the English people. Less than a century earlier, England had been ravaged by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between 2 rival houses, Lancaster and York. By Henry's time, the Tudor dynasty was still young and fragile. To secure it, Henry VIII needed a boy, a prince, a son who would grow into a king. And yet, despite all his power, despite all his wealth, despite his glittering crown and his command over thousands, Henry VIII was powerless against the cruel lottery of nature. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, endured pregnancies that ended in tragedy. Stillbirths, infants who died within days, miscarriages. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. For Catherine, this was heartbreaking but not unusual. Childbirth in the 1500s was perilous, and the death of infants was tragically common. But for Henry, it was a humiliation. A daughter, he believed, was not enough. To him, a woman could not inherit and rule securely. Without a son, the Tudor dynasty could crumble. But Catherine was not just Henry's wife. She was the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. Their marriage had once been a political triumph, uniting England with one of Europe's strongest kingdoms. And for over 2 decades, Catherine had been a loyal queen, intelligent, pious, and deeply respected. To cast her aside would not only dishonor her, it would provoke political chaos across Europe. Yet Henry's obsession with a male heir began to gnaw at him, turning love into bitterness, devotion into desperation. And then came Anne Boleyn, and was everything Catherine was not: younger, spirited, witty, and bold. Unlike many women at court, and refused to be merely another mistress to the king. She demanded more: marriage, a crown, and recognition as queen. For Henry, Anne was intoxicating. She was not only a woman who stirred his desire but also a symbol of hope. Perhaps with her, he could finally have the son he longed for. But there was one obstacle. Henry was still married to Catherine. And according to the laws of the Catholic Church, marriage was sacred and indissoluble. Divorce was almost impossible, and annulments could only be granted under rare conditions. For Henry, this was unbearable. The most powerful man in England suddenly found himself chained by the authority of the Pope in Rome. So he did what no English king had ever dared before. He rebelled against the Church itself. Henry demanded an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been married to his brother, Arthur. He claimed that this violated biblical law, that their union was invalid in the eyes of God. Catherine, humiliated but unbroken, fought fiercely to defend her honor and her daughter's legitimacy. For 7 long years, this battle consumed England, dragging on in courts, councils, and even across Europe as ambassadors and scholars debated the fate of the king's marriage. When the Pope finally refused, Henry's obsession boiled over. He severed ties with Rome, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and forced his kingdom to follow him into a new faith. The Reformation in England, one of the most seismic shifts in European history, was born not out of theology alone but out of Henry's desperate desire for a son. At last, Henry married Anne Boleyn. He had defied the Pope, overturned centuries of tradition, and risked the wrath of Catholic Europe, all for her. For a moment, it seemed love had triumphed, and was crowned queen with spectacular ceremony. Henry believed destiny was finally on his side. And then the cruel wheel of fate turned again, and gave birth, but the child was a girl, Elizabeth. To Henry, this was a crushing disappointment. Though Elizabeth would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs, at the time, she was seen as nothing more than a failed attempt at producing a male heir. Worse still, and suffered miscarriages. Whispers began to spread at court. Was she cursed, just like Catherine? Had Henry defied God for nothing? The man who had once risked everything for and soon grew cold. His passion twisted into suspicion. He accused her of betrayal, of adultery, even of treason. The charges were flimsy, built on rumors and political maneuvering, but they were enough. And was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and in May 1536, executed by sword. The woman Henry had once adored, the woman for whom he had torn his kingdom from the Pope, died on the scaffold, her blood soaking the ground beneath the shadow of the crown she had briefly worn. And Henry, he moved on. This was the man who ruled England, a king whose hunger for power and obsession with a male heir consumed not only his wives but also his nation's future. A man who would marry 6 times, sending 2 wives to their deaths, divorcing 2 others, and leaving behind a legacy of both terror and transformation. Henry VIII's story is not just about kings and queens, not just about palaces and crowns. It is about love warped by ambition, faith torn apart by desire, and the cruel reality of how women's lives were trapped in the ambitions of men. It is about how a single man's obsession with having a son reshaped the course of history. So when we speak of Henry VIII, we must remember, behind the grandeur, behind the portraits and the pageantry, there is a chilling truth. The fate of queens was decided not by their hearts, not by their wisdom, not by their love, but by the gender of the children they bore. And for some, the price of failure was death. To truly understand the decisions of Henry VIII, and the tragic fates of the women who shared his throne, we must step back and examine the world in which he lived. The 16th century was not only an age of kings and queens, but also an age of fragile dynasties, ruthless politics, and deeply entrenched beliefs about gender, family, and the divine order. England at the start of Henry's reign was still scarred by memory of the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil conflict that had torn the kingdom apart for decades. Families had been destroyed, noble houses annihilated, and the legitimacy of the English crown shaken to its core. Henry's father, Henry VII, had only just managed to end that chaos by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and establishing the Tudor dynasty. But this victory did not erase the danger. It only bought time. The Tudors were a new family on the throne, without centuries of established authority. Their claim was fragile, and everyone in Europe knew it. In such a world, producing a male heir was not a matter of vanity. It was a matter of survival. A daughter could inherit, yes, but her marriage would inevitably place power in the hands of another man. That man might be a foreign prince, a noble with rival ambitions, or even a usurper cloaked in legitimacy. A female monarch was seen as a doorway to invasion, civil war, or the collapse of order. And so, when Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, the weight of history pressed down on him. He must not only rule, but ensure the Tudors survived beyond his lifetime. Religion, too, reinforced this pressure. The Catholic Church, which governed the spiritual life of almost all of Europe, held marriage to be sacred. A union blessed by the Church was meant to produce children, not merely for the joy of family, but for the continuation of God's order on earth. A barren marriage, or one that produced only daughters, was not simply unfortunate. It was interpreted by many as a sign of divine disfavor. To the people of the 16th century, kings were God's anointed. If a king could not father a son, whispers of God's judgment could spread like wildfire, undermining his authority both at home and abroad. At the same time, women's roles in society were narrowly defined. A noblewoman's value was measured almost entirely by her ability to secure alliances through marriage and to bear children, preferably sons. Their intelligence, their courage, their loyalty often mattered little if they failed in this central duty. Even queens, adorned with jewels and seated beside their royal husbands, lived under this crushing expectation. Their crowns glittered, but they were fragile, resting on the uncertain outcome of pregnancy after pregnancy. Childbirth itself was dangerous. In an age without modern medicine, every pregnancy carried the risk of death. For royal women, this was not only a personal trial but a political one. A queen's womb was the battlefield on which dynasties rose and fell. Behind the silk gowns and jeweled crowns were women enduring miscarriages, stillbirths, fevers, and the ever-present terror of dying in labor. And yet, while women bore this burden, the blame for failure fell almost entirely on them. Few considered that perhaps it was Henry himself who carried the problem. In a world where men were seen as the strong, the fertile, the chosen, it was unthinkable to suggest that the king might be at fault. Thus, when Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a living son, suspicion fell not on Henry but on her. Whispers of curses, divine punishment, or hidden sins clung to Catherine, as though she alone carried responsibility for fate. Politically, Europe was a chessboard of alliances, and marriage was the most powerful piece on that board. England was not the superpower it would later become. It was a relatively small kingdom compared to the vast might of Spain or the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. For Henry, marrying Catherine of Aragon had been a triumph. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, rulers of Spain, the very monarchs who had united their country, sponsored Columbus's voyage, and stood as champions of Catholic power. By wedding Catherine, England gained prestige, protection, and the promise of children who would bind the Tudors to one of the greatest dynasties in Europe. But as the years passed and no surviving son was born, that alliance began to look less like strength and more like a trap. Henry's frustration was not only personal, it was political. Without a male heir, foreign rulers might see England as weak, vulnerable, ripe for conquest. Nobles at home might scheme, waiting for the Tudor line to falter so they could revive their own claims to the crown. Every year without a son, Henry's anxiety deepened, his fear sharpened, and his temper grew darker. It is also important to remember that the 16th century was a time of profound change. The Renaissance was spreading ideas of human ambition, individual greatness, and the questioning of authority. Across the continent, thinkers were challenging the old ways of the Church. Martin Luther had nailed his theses in 1517, and the Protestant Reformation was beginning to fracture the religious unity of Europe. In this atmosphere of upheaval, Henry's personal crisis with his marriage became more than a domestic issue. It became a spark that would ignite religious and political revolution. Within the walls of the royal court, gossip swirled. Courtiers watched Catherine with pity, some with contempt. They watched Henry with a mix of fear and fascination. Could the king, God's anointed ruler, truly be so desperate, so reckless, that he would break the sacred bonds of marriage? Few could imagine how far Henry would go, but the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The society of Henry's England was therefore one of expectation and pressure. A king's worth was measured not by his smile, not even by his victories in battle, but by the son who would follow him. A queen's worth was measured not by her wisdom, her grace, or her faith, but by the male infant she placed in her husband's arms. And in this crucible of expectation, where politics, religion, and gender collided, love had little room to breathe. It was a world where affection could be shattered by failure, and where the fate of an entire nation could rest on the fragile cry of a newborn child. Thus, when Henry VIII began his reign as a young, handsome, and charismatic king, celebrated by his people, admired by his court, and adored by his bride, few could have predicted the darkness that lay ahead. But the stage was set. The anxieties of dynasty, the iron grip of religion, the narrow roles of women, and the restless ambition of a king, all these forces were converging. And from their collision would emerge one of the most infamous stories of love and death in European history. When Henry VIII first married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, few could have imagined the storm that marriage would unleash on England and on Europe itself. At the time, the union seemed blessed by heaven and fortune alike. Henry was a striking young man, athletic, charismatic, and brimming with energy. He was not yet the bloated, tyrannical figure that later portraits depict. Instead, he was a Renaissance prince, skilled in music, fluent in languages, and handsome enough to dazzle his court. Catherine, though slightly older than Henry, was the perfect match. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, one of the most powerful royal couples of the age. Her marriage to Henry not only cemented an alliance between England and Spain but also promised to stabilize the still fragile Tudor dynasty. Catherine herself was admired for her beauty, her devotion, and her intelligence. Educated in humanist traditions, fluent in Latin, and deeply pious, she was seen as a queen who could stand with dignity among Europe's nobility. For Henry, marrying Catherine was both a political triumph and a personal joy. He was deeply affectionate toward her in the early years. Records describe banquets, tournaments, and lavish court festivities where Henry and Catherine appeared as the very picture of harmony. A young king and queen ready to usher England into a new age of strength and prosperity. But beneath the glitter of the court, a shadow soon began to grow. From the very start of their marriage, Catherine's pregnancies were fraught with tragedy. In 1510, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. A year later, she delivered a son, Henry, who lived for only a few weeks before dying in infancy. This was followed by more heartbreak, miscarriages, stillbirths, and short-lived children who failed to survive beyond the cradle. Each loss cut deep, not only personally but politically. For a royal couple, the birth of a son was not merely a family joy, it was a matter of national survival. At last, in 1516, Catherine gave birth to a healthy daughter, Mary. The court rejoiced, but Henry's joy was muted. Though he loved his daughter, he could not ignore the relentless truth. England still had no male heir. For Catherine, Mary was a gift from God. For Henry, she was a reminder of failure. A daughter could not, in his eyes, secure the dynasty. The lessons of the Wars of the Roses were still vivid. Without a strong male heir, civil war could erupt once again. The Tudor crown, so newly established, might be swept away. In the private chambers of the palace, Catherine's grief was immense. She longed to give Henry the son he desired. She prayed, she fasted, she leaned on her faith with all her strength. Yet with each passing year, her chances grew slimmer. Age weighed upon her, and her health declined from the strain of repeated pregnancies. By the mid-1520s, it became clear that Catherine would likely bear no more children. For Henry, who was still young, vigorous, and ambitious, this was intolerable. The very future of his dynasty seemed trapped in a cruel dead end. And so Henry's mind began to turn. At first, he convinced himself that God was punishing him. Catherine had once been married to Henry's elder brother Arthur, though the marriage had ended quickly with Arthur's death. Henry began to see this as a sign. In the book of Leviticus, he found a verse declaring that a man who married his brother's widow would be childless. Though Catherine and her supporters argued that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, Henry clung to the idea that his union with Catherine was cursed by God. To him, the absence of a son was not a matter of chance or biology. It was divine judgment. This interpretation was convenient, of course, because it gave Henry the justification he needed. If his marriage was cursed, then it was invalid. If it was invalid, then he was free to marry again, and perhaps finally to secure the son he so desperately needed. But the matter was not so simple. Catherine was not only his wife. She was the aunt of Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, who dominated much of Europe. To cast Catherine aside would be to provoke Spain, anger the Pope, and destabilize England's alliances. Yet Henry was not a man to be stopped by obstacles once his will was set. By the mid-1520s his eyes, and his heart, had shifted. A new figure appeared at court, one who would ignite both passion and catastrophe, and Boleyn. But before Anne could rise, Catherine had to fall. The years that followed were cruel for the Queen. She was dragged through endless legal battles as Henry sought an annulment of their marriage. Papal envoys arrived, lawyers argued, and Europe watched as England's king demanded freedom from the woman who had stood beside him for nearly 2 decades. Catherine, proud and steadfast, refused to submit. She declared her marriage lawful, her daughter legitimate, and her conscience clear before God. In public trials, she threw herself at Henry's feet, begging him to see reason, to remember the vows they had made. But Henry's heart was already hardened. His desperation for a son had become obsession. For the people of England, Catherine remained a beloved queen. They saw her dignity, her faith, and her suffering, and many despised Henry for his treatment of her. But kings in the 16th century were not bound by popular opinion. They were bound only by power, and Henry was prepared to tear apart his kingdom to achieve his goal. What began as a marriage filled with promise had by now transformed into a bitter struggle of will and faith. Catherine, once the jewel of the Spanish alliance, was cast aside, humiliated and confined. Henry, once her affectionate husband, now saw her only as an obstacle, a roadblock to his dynasty, a failure in her sacred duty as queen. And so, in the ashes of their marriage, the first cracks appeared in the foundation of England's relationship with the Catholic Church. What began as Henry's personal desperation was about to become a revolution that would forever change the religious and political landscape of England. Catherine of Aragon's tragedy was not only her own. It was the spark that would ignite an inferno, consuming kingdoms and reshaping history. And Boleyn did not enter Henry's life as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, a presence that slowly grew into an obsession. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman at court. Her contemporaries described her as having dark, striking eyes, an alluring charm, and a magnetic wit. What set her apart was not mere appearance, but confidence. Unlike many women who vied for the king's favor, and refused to play the role of mistress, she would not yield her body for fleeting affection. She demanded something greater: marriage, recognition, and the crown itself. This refusal, paradoxically, only inflamed Henry's desire. He was accustomed to women bending to his will, to nobles handing over daughters in exchange for patronage. Anne's resistance transformed her into a prize, a challenge, an enigma he could not ignore. Letters from Henry to and survive, brimming with passion, where he calls himself her loyal servant, her knight, desperate for her favor. The most powerful man in England reduced himself to a lovesick poet, begging for her attention. But Anne's ambition was as sharp as her wit. She was no naive girl swept away by romance. She saw in Henry not only a lover, but an opportunity to elevate herself beyond anything her family could have imagined. The Boleyns were an ambitious family, rising in courtly influence. With and at the king's side, they could eclipse rivals and secure their place at the very heart of power. Yet ambition carried risk, for in England, queens who could not produce heirs did not remain queens for long. As Henry's passion for and deepened, his determination to free himself from Catherine grew more relentless. The struggle became known as the King's Great Matter. For years, Henry battled the Pope for an annulment, and in the shadows of this battle, became both the symbol of Henry's defiance and the scapegoat of his critics. To Henry, and represented hope, the promise of sons, of new beginnings. To Catherine's supporters, she was a seductress, a temptress who had bewitched the king and led him astray. The more resistance Henry faced from Rome, the more radical his actions became. At last, in an unprecedented act of defiance, Henry severed ties with the Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This decision shook Europe to its core. England, once a loyal Catholic nation, was now rebelling against papal authority. Monasteries would be dissolved, land seized, and faith itself torn apart, all because a king wanted a different wife. For Anne, triumph seemed near. In 1533, Henry married her in secret, defying Rome. Soon after, she was crowned queen in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The spectacle was magnificent: jewels, pageantry, and the roar of the crowd. Yet beneath the glitter, there was unease. Many of Henry's subjects still loved Catherine and despised and whom they called the king's whore. Whispers spread that and had entrapped Henry, that her crown was built on scandal and sin. Still, Henry was ecstatic for and was pregnant. This was the moment he had longed for. Surely now God would reward his boldness with a son. The kingdom held its breath. But when the child was born, it was a girl, Elizabeth. To modern eyes, this child would one day prove to be one of the greatest monarchs in English history, ruling with wisdom and strength. But to Henry in 1533, Elizabeth was a crushing disappointment. His gamble had yielded not the son he craved, but another daughter. Still, Henry clung to hope, and was young. There would be more children, more chances. Surely a boy would come. Yet fate was cruel, and suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. Each loss weakened her position. Each failure hardened Henry's heart. The woman for whom he had defied the Pope, torn his nation apart, and overturned centuries of tradition was now failing in the one task that mattered most: producing a male heir. At court, enemies of the Buleyns sharpened their knives. Nobles who had supported Catherine, clergymen who despised the break with Rome, and rivals who envied the Boleyn family all began to conspire. They whispered rumors of Anne's arrogance, her temper, her inability to bear sons. Some claimed she practiced witchcraft, that she had enchanted Henry with dark powers. Others spread slanderous tales of her infidelity, naming men at court as her supposed lovers. Henry, ever fickle, began to listen. His passion cooled, and suspicion crept in. By 1536, Anne's enemies saw their chance. She was arrested and accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were flimsy, built on gossip and invention, but in a world where the king's will was law, they were enough. And was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once been honored as queen. She protested her innocence with fierce dignity, declaring that she had been faithful to Henry and to God. But her words meant nothing against the machinery of power now set against her. Her trial was a spectacle of injustice. A jury of nobles, many of them her enemies, found her guilty. Even her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the judgment. Henry, once her adoring lover, did nothing to save her. The same passion that had raised her up now condemned her to death. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold. Dressed in a dark gown, she mounted the platform with grace, her eyes steady, her composure unbroken. Before the crowd, she declared her innocence, yet she spoke no word against Henry, asking only that God protect the king. A French swordsman had been brought to ensure a swift death. With a single stroke, Anne's head was severed from her body, her blood staining the wooden planks. Thus ended the life of the woman who had reshaped England, who had been queen for just 3 years, and whose brief reign had cost so much. Henry moved on quickly, marrying Jane Seymour only days after Anne's execution. For him, Anne was already a shadow, a mistake erased. But for history, she would remain unforgettable, the queen who rose higher than any woman before her, only to fall into darkness as swiftly as she had ascended. Anne's tragedy reveals the dangerous game of ambition, love, and power in the Tudor court. For Henry, wives were not companions but instruments, judged solely on their ability to deliver sons. For Anne, her wit and charm could win her a crown, but they could not protect her from the iron grip of fate. And for England, her fall was a reminder that beneath the pomp of royalty lay a world of ruthless calculation, where human lives were pawns in the pursuit of power. When Anne Boleyn's head fell beneath the French swordsman's blade in May 1536, Henry VIII wasted no time in moving forward. Within days, he was engaged to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. To some, Jane seemed like a carefully chosen contrast to Anne. Where Anne had been fiery, witty, and ambitious, Jane was gentle, modest, and submissive. She embodied the image of the quiet, obedient wife Henry now craved. But Jane was not merely a balm to Henry's wounded pride. She was, above all, another chance at the one thing Henry desired most, a male heir. For once, fate seemed to reward him. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. At long last, Henry had what he had yearned for across nearly 3 decades of rule, a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. The joy in England was immense. Bells rang, feasts were held, and Henry was exalted as a king finally favored by God. Yet triumph came with tragedy. The birth was long and difficult, and within 2 weeks, Jane Seymour died of postnatal complications. Henry was devastated. He would later call Jane his true wife, the only one he believed had fulfilled her duty as queen. In truth, his adoration was bound less to love than to the fact that she had given him the son he desired. Jane's death plunged Henry into mourning, but his grief was tinged with satisfaction. The dynasty was secured. Still, kings could not remain widowers for long. Marriage was not merely personal. It was political. By the late 1530s, Henry sought another alliance to strengthen England's position in Europe. His advisors arranged a union with Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose marriage promised to bind England to Protestant allies against Catholic powers like France and Spain. But when Anne arrived in England in 1540, Henry was horrified. Famously, he declared that she looked nothing like the flattering portrait he had been shown. To Henry, she was unattractive, awkward, and unappealing. Their marriage was never consummated, and within months it was annulled. And, however, proved shrewd. She accepted the annulment with grace, was given a generous settlement, and lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life, known as the King's beloved sister. In many ways, she was the luckiest of Henry's 6 wives. But Henry's pride, wounded by the embarrassment of the failed marriage, soon turned toward another infatuation. Catherine Howard, a teenage cousin of Anne Boleyn. Catherine was young, lively, and flirtatious, bringing vitality to the aging, increasingly unhealthy king. By now, Henry was no longer the handsome prince of his youth. Years of indulgence had left him obese, suffering from ulcers, and prone to fits of rage. Yet in Catherine Howard's presence, he felt rejuvenated, a man still capable of passion. He showered her with gifts, jewels, and adoration, calling her his rose without a thorn. But Catherine was dangerously naive. Whispers of her past romances began to spread, and soon accusations of adultery reached the king's ears. For Henry, already paranoid and insecure, this was the ultimate betrayal. Catherine was arrested, tried, and condemned. In 1542, at just 19 years old, she was executed at the Tower of London. Witnesses said she approached the scaffold trembling, barely more than a child, begging for mercy from God. Her death reinforced the brutal truth. Being Queen of England under Henry VIII was as much a death sentence as a crown. By this time, Henry was a man transformed by age, power, and paranoia. The athletic prince who had once dazzled his court was now a tyrant, feared by his subjects and consumed by suspicion. His final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 reflected this change. Catherine Parr was intelligent, diplomatic, and cautious. Twice widowed before marrying Henry, she understood the dangerous game of survival better than any of his previous wives. She acted as a nurse to the ailing king, tending to his health, soothing his temper, and even reconciling him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr did not challenge Henry's authority directly. Instead, she navigated carefully, using patience and tact to remain in his favor. Yet even she was not safe. At one point, her interest in religious reform nearly led to her arrest for heresy. But Catherine, displaying remarkable cunning, threw herself at Henry's mercy, declaring that she only debated theology to distract him from his suffering. The flattery worked, and Henry pardoned her. She survived him, becoming the only one of Henry's wives to outlive the king. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom forever changed. He had married 6 women, divorced 2, executed 2, 1 died in childbirth, and 1 survived him. His reign had torn England from the Catholic Church, unleashed the English Reformation, and rewritten the very fabric of the monarchy. And at the heart of it all were the women who paid the price for his ambitions. What unites their stories is not simply tragedy, but the crushing weight of expectation placed upon them. Catherine of Aragon endured decades of humiliation, and Boleyn lost her head to false charges. Jane Seymour gave her life in childbirth, and of Cleves was discarded like a political miscalculation. Catherine Howard was executed as a child bride caught in a dangerous web, and Catherine Parr survived only through intelligence and caution. For Henry, wives were never truly partners. They were vessels, pawns, and instruments of his will. His love could be intoxicating, his devotion overwhelming, but when his hopes were dashed, affection turned swiftly to anger, and anger to cruelty. Few monarchs in history so clearly demonstrated how the private obsessions of one man could ripple outward, shaking the foundations of an entire kingdom. In the end, Henry achieved what he had so desperately desired, a son, Edward. Yet Edward's reign would be brief, and it would be his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, born of the very women Henry had cast aside, who would leave the greater mark on history. In a bitter twist of fate, the daughters Henry dismissed would outshine the son he idolized. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, would become one of the most celebrated rulers in the world, proving that greatness did not depend on gender, nor on a father's approval. The story of Henry VIII's marriages is not simply about love or betrayal, but about the collision of personal desire with political necessity. It is about how one man's obsession with securing his dynasty destroyed lives, reshaped a nation, and altered the course of history. 6 women wore the crown of England as Henry's queens, but their reigns were measured not in years or achievements, but in the shadow of one man's relentless pursuit of a son. When we look back at the life of Henry VIII, it is easy to see only the surface of scandal. The broken marriages, the executions, the endless parade of queens and mistresses. His story has been told countless times as a soap opera of passion, betrayal, and cruelty. But beneath the drama lies a more profound and unsettling question. Were Henry's marriages ever about love, or were they always about power? At first glance, it may seem like Henry did pursue love, at least in the beginning. His courtship with Catherine of Aragon carried the dignity of dynastic duty but also the warmth of companionship. With Anne Boleyn, there was undeniable passion, a fiery attraction that pushed him to risk his throne, his faith, and even the unity of his kingdom. With Catherine Howard, too, we see the hunger of an aging man trying desperately to recapture the thrill of youth. These moments look like love, or at least infatuation. But love, true love, requires sacrifice. It demands humility, patience, and a willingness to put another's needs above one's own. Henry VIII, a king raised to believe that the world revolved around his desires, was incapable of such surrender. Every time his feelings clashed with his ambitions, power won. Catherine of Aragon was loved, until she could no longer bear him a son. And Boleyn was adored, until her wit and fire threatened to eclipse his authority. Jane Seymour was idealized, not because of who she was, but because she gave him a son, and then died before she could disappoint him. Henry's love was conditional, fragile, and ultimately self-serving. The women in his life were valued not for themselves, but for what they could provide: heirs, alliances, or affirmation of his power. If they failed, they were cast aside, disgraced, or killed. In this way, his story becomes a chilling reflection of what happens when power masquerades as love. Yet Henry was not simply a monster. To paint him as such is to miss the complexity of his humanity. He was a man raised in a world where kings were seen as God's anointed rulers, where the stability of a dynasty could mean the difference between order and chaos, where a lack of a male heir could plunge a kingdom into civil war. His obsession with sons was not merely personal pride, it was political necessity, reinforced by centuries of tradition and fear. The shadow of England's bloody Wars of the Roses still loomed over his reign, reminding everyone of the dangers of disputed succession. In that sense, Henry's choices were shaped by the weight of history as much as by his own will. But power corrupts when it becomes unchecked, and Henry's power was absolute. Unlike ordinary men, he could not be challenged by his wives, his counselors, or even the Pope himself. Every obstacle could be swept aside, through annulment, through execution, through revolution. In such a world, the line between love and power collapses. Desire becomes demand, affection becomes ownership, and marriage becomes yet another battlefield of politics. The tragedy of Henry's 6 wives is not only that they suffered under his tyranny, but that their humanity was erased in the process. Catherine of Aragon became a symbol of defiance, and Boleyn a scapegoat, Jane Seymour a saintly mother, and of Cleves a failed bargain, Catherine Howard a cautionary tale, and Catherine Parr a survivor. Each of them was far more complex than the roles history has assigned, but Henry's power reduced their identities to fragments that served his narrative. They were not queens in their own right, they were characters in his play. And yet, history carries a strange irony. For all his obsession with sons, it was his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who shaped the destiny of England. Mary's reign, though troubled, reaffirmed the power of monarchy. Elizabeth's reign, golden and glorious, secured England's place as a world power. The daughter Henry dismissed as illegitimate, Elizabeth, became one of the greatest rulers in history. In this way, Henry's desperate pursuit of power through sons was undone by the very women he undervalued. So what do we learn from this? At its core, the story of Henry VIII is not just about one man and 6 wives. It is about the eternal tension between love and power, and how easily power can consume love when left unchecked. Love seeks to give while power seeks to take. Love requires equality, while power demands dominance. Love endures, while power crumbles the moment it is challenged. Henry wanted to be loved, by his wives, by his people, by God himself. But he wanted to be obeyed even more. And in the end, the fear he inspired outlasted the affection he desired. His reign left a kingdom divided, a church fractured, and a personal legacy forever shadowed by cruelty. For us, looking back across centuries, the question lingers. How often do we, too, confuse love with power in our own lives? How often do we demand rather than give, control rather than cherish, dominate rather than honor? Henry VIII's story warns us that when power masquerades as love, tragedy follows. True love cannot survive where one person holds all the power. And so we return to the question, love or power? Henry VIII chose power again and again, and in doing so he lost both. His marriages, meant to secure his dynasty, instead left a legacy of blood, betrayal, and sorrow. But they also gave rise to Elizabeth I, a queen who would redefine what it meant to rule, and who proved that love of country could achieve far more than power over others. In the end, Henry's life reminds us that power may command obedience, but only love commands loyalty. Power may win battles, but only love builds legacies. And while Henry VIII is remembered as a king, it is the women he wronged, and the daughter he underestimated, who transformed his tragedy into history's lesson. And now, after walking through the life, loves, and losses of Henry VIII, I want to turn the question over to you. Because this story is not just about a king who lived 5 centuries ago. It is, in many ways, about us. About the choices we make when we are caught between desire and duty, between passion and power. Henry's life forces us to ask ourselves, what do we truly seek in our relationships? Love or control? Do we value the people around us for who they are or only for what they can give us? Do we nurture or do we demand? Think about it. Henry had almost everything a person could dream of. Wealth, titles, influence, armies, even the power to change the religion of his nation. And yet, for all that, he died lonely, sick and bitter, surrounded not by love but by fear. His 6 marriages, instead of bringing him peace, became symbols of pain. Why? Because power can never satisfy the hunger that only love can fill. Power can command loyalty, but it cannot win hearts. Power can silence voices, but it cannot erase truth. Power can destroy, but it cannot heal. So I want you to pause and reflect. Where in your life are you chasing power when you should be choosing love? Where are you trying to control outcomes instead of nurturing connection? Where are you valuing results more than people? Henry's story is a cautionary tale, but it doesn't have to be ours. We can learn from his mistakes. We can choose humility over pride. We can choose faithfulness over ambition. We can choose to honor the people in our lives, not for what they do for us, but for who they are. Because here's the truth. 500 years from now, no one will remember the titles we held, the wealth we gathered, or the power we clung to. What they will remember, what will echo through generations, are the lives we touched with love. And that's why history matters. It's not just a collection of dates and dusty names. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are, where we fail, and what we can become. Henry VIII reminds us of the danger of letting power consume love. His daughter, Elizabeth I, reminds us of the strength that rises when love of people outweighs fear of losing control. So the challenge I leave you with today is this. Look at your own life through the lens of history. Ask yourself, are you building a legacy of power or a legacy of love? And if you found yourself moved, challenged, or inspired by this story, I invite you to keep journeying with me. This is just the beginning. On this channel, we will continue to uncover the hidden truths of history, not just to know the past, but to understand ourselves more deeply. So don't let this reflection end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Henry VIII ever truly loved? Or was it always about power? I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this, stories that are raw, human, and unafraid to ask the hard questions, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. History may be 500 years old, but the lessons are for today. Remember, power fades, love endures, and in the end, it is not the crown on our head, but the love in our hearts that will define us.